Afghanistan in 1990 was no place for tourists. After a decade of Russian occupation, the Afghan resistance was fighting back. Into this mayhem, following a dream held since he was 8 years old, came New Zealander Richard Loseby. He found himself knee-deep in a bloody war, was befriended by Mujahideen resistance fighters, and had countless adventures. His only way out was to walk for 30 days and nights across Afghanistan and into Pakistan. Since then, Richard has tried in vain to contact a man who became more like a brother. Nebi was his name. 13 years later, Richard Loseby decided the only way he was going to find Nebi was to return to Mashhad. He tells John Hudson his story.
As someone said, you're the only advertising person I know that, you know, can take apart an AK-47 and put it back together again in sort of 18 seconds or something.
Early one morning, almost a year ago, Richard Loseby set up his camcorder in the garden and recorded this message.
This afternoon I'm going to jump on a plane and fly to Iran, having just dropped the children off at school. This is always a strange one. But my task is very simple. 13 years ago I was in Iran and Afghanistan. My name was Masood Mahandaspur, not Richard Loseby.
Over the years, Richard had tried to contact those with whom he had forged friendships, particularly a man called Nebi.
When I left and walked across the country to Pakistan, I left him behind, and I wasn't able to ever get in touch with him again. He had no address, no phone number. It was just a name.
In battle-torn Afghanistan, it was Nebi who taught Richard how to stay alive. And it was Nebi who saved Richard's life. And something else. It was Nebi who gave Richard his Afghan name.
And I need to know what has happened to him. He was more than a friend. He was almost like a brother. And that's a strange feeling now, sitting so many thousands of miles away. Would I be successful, or would it be a complete failure? I had no idea. It's going to be a very interesting time, and I have no idea what is going to happen. I can only put myself in a position where things will happen to me. And there's a bit of a detective story to the whole thing, because how do you find an individual in such a harsh country?
Mashhad is Iran's second largest city and a leading religious centre. Every year the population of nearly 2 million more than doubles as pilgrims flock to the gold dome tomb of the fabled Muslim leader Imam Reza. Somehow Richard managed to retrace his steps of 13 years earlier.
Last time I was here, it was the year 1368 in the Islamic calendar, which is 1989. And I stood pretty much where I'm standing now, thinking seriously whether I should cross the road over there to walk into Hezbollah. I'd finally found them, but I was questioning whether it was truly madness to contemplate going into Afghanistan. Well, as it happened, I decided to cross the road. Nothing seems to have changed, except there's no one outside the front gates at the moment, as there were last time. Dozens of Afghans, having just come back from the war, covered in dust, wrapped in their blankets. This is the most amazing thing. I could come back and find that they are still there, in the same place. And they took us upstairs into the same room that I once sat in and asked to be taken into Afghanistan. There in that same room was one of the men that went with me into Afghanistan. They were amazed because they thought I was dead. When I left them and went off into the mountains, they heard some weeks later that a foreigner had been shot and killed up somewhere on the way to Kandahar, and they believed that it was me. And without hearing anything otherwise, it just became fact through all those years.
But news of Nebi was vague. At first, Richard thought they said he'd been killed. His journey over almost before it had begun.
I'd gone from the depths of optimism and hope of finding, at the point when I found Hezbollah, to the depths of depression to say that my journey was now at its end, to great relief to discover 48 hours later that, no, I was mistaken. He had been injured.
Amazingly, Richard was able to track Nebby through hospital records, even after all this time. Nebby had suffered extensive leg injuries, but had survived. There was even an old telephone number, but that turned out to be a dead end. But Nebby was alive, and was last heard of in Herat, in Afghanistan.
I had promised not to go into Afghanistan. That was one of the things that my wife had said. And of course, I always knew I was going to break that promise. That was the worst thing. And but I suppose there are some things you have to keep from your next of kin so they don't worry too much.
Ever since Alexander the Great, many have travelled to Herat. Arabs, Mongols, Turks, Persians, Afghans and Russians. And now Richard Lowsby.
It's very strange being back. It's the smell of, I don't know what it is. It's bodies, you know, hot and sweaty. It's that smell reminds me of the times before in Afghanistan, and the dust that just pervades everything.
And once you were in Afghanistan, I mean, you could have been anywhere, couldn't you?
Yes, again, I'd start from scratch, and I started retracing my steps and going over some of the old places that I had been with Hezbollah during the war, and finding them was interestingly enough, and some people who lived in the area remembered Hezbollah, they remembered some of the key people, but not Nebby.
What have you set up?
Where I've ended up is probably in the area where Hezbollah had their comité. And it's incredible to be back here. The gardens are still here, but still in ruins, where they grew grapes and of course the wheat to make the bread, and the pathways are still over and under rubbish, but it's much the same. Even the water is still flowing. So, salam alaikum. And so talk to this camera, and the people are walking by thinking, what the hell is going on? But yeah, this was home for a month.
Were you involved in the fighting yourself?
I was taken, yes. It was one of those things that that they wouldn't necessarily leave me behind and say, rest here, Masood, you'll be safe. You know, I was one of them, so they took me along. And there were many times, you know, you'd be woken at 3 a.m. in the morning and then said, you know, come on, harakat, you know, let's go. And you'd be off somewhere. And then by dawn they'd be fighting, and it was pretty tough, you know. They usually used simple weaponry. They had rocket-propelled grenades, RPGs, to go in and knock out key forts, and then they would go from door to door. And
they were dangerous times.
Very.
You had a Kalashnikov?
I did for 1 or 2 days. I think when I was first shot at, I took it personally. And I think I might have just sort of become slightly deranged. I mean, war will do that to you at any time, but I decided that I had to learn how to use one. But when I came to my senses, I realized that this was foolhardy and ridiculous. I'd probably do more harm to myself. And so I gave it back.
The search for Nebby continued.
The thing is that in Herat, no one trusts you. You ask for someone and they ask, why do you want to find this person? And so, first of all, you have to prove that you're not trying to, you know, find them because they owe you money or that some grudge you're trying to settle. And so they won't give you the information that you ask for just then.
They say 95% of luck is being there, and never was it truer than now. Word soon got around that a Westerner was looking for someone called Nebby. Then came the messenger.
It's just before dawn. Abdul Latif is going to drive me to the border. But everything is falling into place nicely.
The good news was that Richard finally had Nebby's address. The bad was that the address was back in Mashhad in Iran. And so it came to pass that Richard Lowsby once again travelled the bumpy road that led to the Iranian border.
This is the walk between Afghanistan and Iran.
The pressure was on. All Richard had was a scribbled address and just 24 hours to find Nebby. It seemed impossible.
Okay, this is my new friend who's driving me to Mashhad.
This one Jigar.
Richard.
Salam Asmadi.
Boy, if I survive this, I don't know. How?
Once again, his best chance lay with Hezbollah.
So I went back to Mashhad after my time in Herat and went back to Hezbollah and walked in and said, I found him and he is alive. And I showed them the piece of paper which his location was written on. And I waited and we sat and talked and someone had gone to get Nebby and then of course there was a sort of a clatter of a motorbike outside in the courtyard and some footsteps on a stairwell, and next minute there was this man standing at the doorway. He'd changed, he'd aged a lot more than I had. But it was just a fantastic moment, I suppose. He just walked up and then the Afghan way, you know, a hug and a kiss to each cheek, and then we just stood there sort of laughing, I think, for about 5 minutes, and you know, and then sat down and filled in all the gaps of what had been going on.
And so Nebby was found. But there was even more to celebrate. By incredible coincidence, that afternoon Nebby's brother was to be married. Richard became the guest of honour.
It was just incredible to see him, that he had made that transfer from fighter or warrior to a family man.
Richard's quest was nearly over. He needed just one final piece to complete the puzzle.
And he took me home and I was able to meet his wife and his children. One of the littlest of whom was called Masood. So in a way, he'd named his youngest after the name that he had originally given to me. It was incredible.
We're going to be a friend for life.
Yeah, it's my last afternoon, so we sort of say goodbye after this, and he'll drop me off at the train station. It's a shame in a way that we have to say goodbye, so things have turned out really well, which of course makes me very glad. The best thing is I can leave and know that everything is going really well and I'm not this well. We're lucky that we can go and visit these places, but to actually give up everything here and go and live there, I think that would be probably foolhardy and wrong.
Back in New Zealand, Richard Loseby is married with 2 children and creative head of an Auckland advertising agency.
Awards here are now as important. Advertising is its own land, and Afghanistan is somewhere else. I've tried to get in touch with him again by sending a letter, but I never get a reply, and I know that's because he's there, but he's in hiding. So one of these days I'll jump in a plane and go back and knock on his door. Once you go to Afghanistan, it gets its fingers into you and it doesn't let you go. It's a fantastic place. I think more and more people will probably go there. Heaven forbid it'll probably be on the tourist trail one day, which would be quite sad.
And Richard Loseby has written a book on his adventures. It's called Looking for the Afghan and is published this week.